In this series of videos, we take a step up and take a look at some of the more advanced concepts of programming. Now, before you embark on these, you should first have watched all the introduction to programming videos which we covered under the Programming Basics section, and also had some decent practical experience in programming over a period of time. As such, these videos probably shouldn't be used in an upfront theory way to learn the more advanced parts of programming. Instead, come back to them after you've programmed for a while and use them to reflect and consolidate. In this video, we're going to take a look at subroutines and how they work and how they're called, and be able to explain their advantages. You're going to be able to describe the use of parameters to pass data and be able to use interfaces. And you're going to be able to understand what returning values are and the importance of local variables. Okay, so as we already know, subroutines fall mainly in a theoretical sense into procedures and functions. A procedure, or function, is a self-contained set of commands that can be called from different parts of the program. They're useful for breaking a program down into manageable sections and preventing duplicate sections of code when some code is needed more than once. These whole concepts also add to the maintainability of code, making it easier to read and debug. Just as a really straightforward example, imagine we break a complex problem down into smaller problems. This method is known as Stepwise Approach, and each major step of a problem becomes a procedure, function, or subroutine. So here we've got the idea of making a cup of coffee. This would be our program, but if we break that procedure down into a number of smaller steps, these become fill the kettle, boil the kettle, put coffee in cup, etc., etc. These are the major steps or procedures for making a cup of coffee. The detail and the coded commands of how to do each task would be hidden within each of these procedures. As we've already seen from previous videos we've looked at, procedures and functions have a name, and then their code is encased within that procedure. To run the code in this procedure, you simply call the procedure using its name. So this program actually starts here. The first thing it does is call the procedure fill kettle. The code then jumps to here, runs through here, and when it reaches the end and exits the procedure, the code jumps back to here and then carries on and exits. A function, as we know, is very similar to a procedure. A function can take 0, 1 or more parameters, perform an action, but in addition to a procedure, it must return a value to the part of the program that called it. Let's actually have a look at the anatomy of a function in a little more detail. So here I have a function called sqrt. It performs square root. It's part of the maths library. Here is the call to the function with the function name. Here is the parameter which I pass into the function. In this circumstance, the square root function takes one parameter, and that parameter is an integer. So here I've called the square root function and I've passed it the value 10 as an integer. This would then go in to the function, which will perform its code, produce an answer, but remember, a function must return a result. It would then return the result, and that result gets assigned here into x. So you notice that when you call a function, you must have the ability for the result to be assigned somewhere. So it's quite typical to see functions on the right hand side of possibly an assignment statement. We call the function, we pass in a parameter, and then we assign the result somewhere else. Now, there are many useful functions, and we've actually looked at quite a few of these in more detail in the section on string manipulation, so we won't go through them in detail here. But we have functions which can return the uppercase of anything you pass in, or can turn the lowercase version of anything you pass in. We have functions which can extract text from a string, from say the left, or from the right. Here in this example we have a function called left. We pass it two parameters. The first parameter is a string. The second parameter is an integer. Notice that when we have multiple parameters we separate them by commas. Inside the left function what happens is we take the second parameter 7, extract the first 7 characters from this string. The result, which would be the word welcome, then gets returned and stored in Y. So just pause the video for a second then, and what do you think these two sections of code would do here? Okay, so this top one is a function call, but inside it is a function call. Now this is perfectly acceptable, and you start evaluating from the middle outwards. So let's take the middle function call first. It's left, and it passes in the variable y, welcome to computer, and the number 7. Well, as we already know, when you pass in welcome to computer and 7, it extracts the first 7 characters from this string and returns them. Now this gets returned here, so this whole section here gets crossed out and gets replaced with what was returned, which was the text welcome. We then move to the outer function, and the outer function uppercases whatever's in brackets, which was the returned value from the left function. So, and then that gets assigned to x. So what ends up in x is the word welcome, but all in uppercase. Same thing happens down here then. We have a function call within a function call, so we start in the middle, and we call the right function on welcome to computing and pass it welcome to computing and 12. So welcome to computing comes in, we extract the right 12 characters, which is that. This is then what gets returned, the string to computing, and then the left function gets performed on to computing and extracts 2 characters, which is these two. Okay, let's have a slightly more detailed look then at how a function is actually constructed and how it looks in a modern high-level programming language. This code syntax is taken from Visual Basic, but it will be typical of pseudocode you would see in the exam. Down here we have our main program. Up here I have a function. This main program has a couple of local variables, and it also has a line here where we say total cost equals sales price plus total tax. Now total tax is a function call, and you can see that here it takes in one parameter, and that parameter will get passed into here. So let's look at the various parts then. Here we have the function name. Notice that it has to match the name being used down here, otherwise it won't know what function to call. Here we have the arguments that the function needs and their data type. So the arguments or parameters that this function needs to take in when you call it is one variable called cost, and its data type is a single. And that's what happens down here. Here we have the return type. Now this is very important. You may take in a single, but then the calculations that happen inside may result in a double value, and it's the double which is being returned, which means that this value here, where we're going to end up storing the result, has to be able to store a double, and it does. This is where the function returns the value. Now this can happen a couple of ways, and you can spot it in your exams. One way you can spot the return of a value out of a function and back to the part of the program it was called from is when the function name matches here. So the function name is total tax. We say total tax equals national tax plus city tax. This calculation happens, ends up in here, and this is the return call, and so this would end up coming back to here. The other way you might see in the exam is simply the word return. And here is the call to the total tax, and you can see it passes in one single parameter. In this circumstance, it's passing in the value 500. We call total tax, and that value ends up coming into here. That's the basics then of how functions and interfaces and subroutines work. In a couple of other videos later in this series, we will be looking at the passing of parameters in more detail and exactly how it all works, so you'll get to have a lot more exposure and familiarity with these concepts.